Hello, YouTube. So we are now 4 weeks in since the beginning of this crisis between the mafias and the Noboa government in Ecuador. And I figured it was a good time to give a little update on how things are going. And I don't want to call it a prediction, that's the wrong word, more of an analysis about where things are likely to go over the coming months and years in this basically a war between the state and the cartels. So let's get into it. This first 4 weeks, the very first days, Ecuador was all over the international news because of the attack on a TV station live on air, because of kidnappings of police and kidnappings of over 100 prison guards and the takeover of several prisons by the cartel members and gang members in Ecuador. And the government responded differently than previous governments have to this type of unrest in Ecuador in the past. The Noboa government is different from the governments we've had, and they were tough. They immediately declared a state of emergency, declared that these criminal organizations were one step beyond just criminals, that what they were doing, the way they were behaving was the actions of terrorists. And so they declared them terrorist organizations and unleashed the military to fight this basically an existential threat to Ecuadorian society. And it was incredibly effective. And it was incredibly effective in part because these, like the lower level gangs in Ecuador that are kind of associates of various cartels, international cartels, they weren't very experienced with having to deal with a government that actually went after them. They were used to a lot of incompetency from the government, incompetency from the police, and basically inaction. They could do whatever horrific thing they were up to, and they got away with it. Nobody really went after them with any seriousness. So this government's different, and these first 4 weeks, the cartels have been on the run. They've been getting swept up. There's been huge numbers of arrests. There's been some very significant drug busts and seizures of weapons and other equipment that they were using. And the prisons have been cleaned up. The prisons used to be, for the most part, free housing, right? Free housing for the cartels, but they had cell phones, they had drugs, they had prostitutes. They could run their little empires. The crime bosses could run their empire from within prison. Really didn't change much for them other than that they had free rent, right? So, and they weren't allowed to leave. Though, when they did want to get out, they could. And that's part of what triggered this crisis, is the big prison breaks. When this current government once again got serious and was like, hey, we're going to build a new supermax prison. And the rules are changed. You're not going to be able to run your little empire from within prison anymore. So that's what's happened. And right now, the Noboa government is super popular in Ecuador because they have been so effective. Now, the cartels are going to respond. And I think we're going to see probably in the next coming days or weeks how the cartels are going to respond. And here is the most likely scenario, in my opinion. The cartels know that to succeed in Ecuador, they need a different president, they need a different government, that the Noboa government is not going to play ball with them. And they have a playbook by which they're going to operate, and it's probably very reflective of Mexico, where there was a point at which the Mexican government attempted to get tough on the cartels, and what worked for getting rid of that government in Mexico was a combination of infiltration and sowing chaos, violence for violence sake, in order to undermine the public's confidence in that government. So I think what we're about to see in Ecuador is a renewed wave of violence, where the cartels, they've reorganized, they've reformed, and they go, all right, we got 14 months until the next election. We need to undermine confidence in Noboa by just creating chaos and violence for violence sake so that the people are unhappy with the current government, right? If violence increases because of this operation against the mafias, against the cartels, then there will be a tendency for the Ecuadorian population to go, hey, we want to go back to the good old days when we weren't fighting the cartels. We want to go back to a government that made us feel safer. They were safer because the cartels were allowed to just grow and fester into the point where they could assassinate politicians. But there was less violence against everyday civilians, everyday members of the public, because there was no motivation for the cartels to do that. Now there is. Now the cartels are probably going to commit some horrific acts of violence in order to try to get a more friendly or sponsored by them president into power so that they can go back to business as usual, because Ecuador is so strategically important to the drugs trade. They're not going to just roll over. And more experienced and more professional leaders within these international cartels are going to start using tactics that have worked elsewhere. Those tactics worked in Mexico. So what I think is going to happen is that there is going to be a massive increase in violence in Ecuador, expressly for the purpose of undermining public confidence in President Noboa before the next elections. I think that the cartels recognize that their way to maintain their foothold in Ecuador and keep this as their strategically important cocaine trafficking hub is to get a president that they are aligned with, somebody that they have sponsored and know they can work with, into power. And the way that they can do that is horrific acts of violence that make the public believe that they won't be safe under President Noboa. I gotta be careful how I say this because I don't want to sound prejudiced, but the level of political education in Ecuador is not very high. And the people are kind of in the moment. They aren't necessarily all thinking very long term. So they think about what's happening right now and what their quality of life is right now, and aren't necessarily going to look at the long-term effects of voting out Noboa and voting in a president that is promising more safety by not fighting the cartels. So that is what I predict is going to happen. And I'm surprised it hasn't already begun, but I think it took a little bit of time for the cartels to figure out how to respond. They were caught off guard, but I think in the next few days or weeks, we're going to see that uptick. We're going to see that type of shock value violence, whether it is kidnapping or killing a bunch of students, or going after public officials, or going after the police and the military, and specifically token things that are designed to make people feel unsafe. And at the same time, so there is a political figure in Ecuador named Leodonis Iza. I don't know if I'm butchering his name or not, but he's a fairly powerful indigenous leader. He is about as far left as you can come. He's openly stated that his goal for Ecuador is to create an Indo-communist state. So I don't know what that means for all of us that are not part of an indigenous tribe, but he's an indigenous leader and comes from that world, and that's who he has in mind and where his power base is. And Leodonis Iza has already declared his intention to do what's called a paro. Now, every few years, Ecuador has a paro, which is basically a protest that shuts the transportation, shuts the government down. The paros have in previous years gotten bad enough that there was one where they were marching on the Capitol, and one of the previous presidents got in his helicopter and fled, got out of town because he was scared they were going to capture him or something. Usually the paros are basically just blockading all the roads so that there is no economic activity. You can't get gas, you can't get food. And they do this until there's a negotiation that at least partially meets their demands, enough for them to be like, all right, we'll let things go back to normal. So he's declared his intent to hold a paro, a big protest, to shut down transportation, shut down Ecuador basically, because he doesn't like the fact that Noboa has proposed raising taxes by 3% to fund this huge military and police operation against the cartels. Now, I think a huge factor in whether the Noboa government is successful and can keep Ecuadorians safe and can defeat the cartels is whether they can pay for it. So one way to pay for it is raise taxes and hope that economic activity continues enough to generate enough taxes to fund these needed projects. And another way to pay for it is outside support. 80% of the cocaine going through Ecuador is reported to be going towards Europe. The other 20%, some of it for American markets, some of it Asian markets. But Ecuador needs its partner countries, its trading partners, countries that are interested in a stable Ecuador that doesn't have massive migration north and doesn't have, doesn't become a narco state, to help. Noboa needs help from other governments, needs to find a way to help. This is a government that's been bankrupted by previous administrations. It's in debt up to its eyeballs. And so Ecuador needs a lifeline in order for the current government to win, to be able to counter these very well-funded cartels. If their goal is to just sow chaos and violence to undermine this government, to be able to bring in a president that is aligned with Venezuela or Russia or China and facilitates the drug trade and facilitates sowing chaos here rather than stabilizing this part of the world. So that's my 2 cents, my analysis, because I don't like the word prediction, my analysis of what is likely to occur. And these aren't my favorite kind of videos to make. This isn't the direction I want my channel to go, but once again, this is what's going on. I will try to balance this with my typical types of videos of going on trips and adventures. Right now I'm planning a trip out to the coast. I'm a little nervous about travel right now to that part of the coast because it's in Esmeraldas province, but I'm probably heading out to Mompichi because there's a guy out there that needs some help with this electrical work and I know how to fix it. So I might take you along, make a video about, during this crisis, traveling to a part of the country that a lot of folks believe is just a no-go zone. I'm fairly confident right now I can get out there and get back safely, but who knows? We'll see. Ciao.